In this video, I'm going to show you how to make tileable textures. Sometimes these might also be referred to as seamless textures. So why are these important in game art creation? The reason is because this is the secret into why we can have very detailed textures in larger spaces. For instance, if we look at this screenshot from Fallout 4, you've done a little bit with working with creating materials already where we create a material on a single unwrap, which works fine for something like this milk machine or this bread box or the toaster. But what about things like the wall or the ceiling or the floor? We can't possibly unwrap an object like those onto a single unwrap. Otherwise, the material would either have to be gigantic or we would have to have, it would be very pixelated, it'd be very minimal, like the detail that we could get on there, but we can see that this is a very highly detailed material. So how do we do that? That is what we use tileable textures for. In your 114 class, when you actually learn how to 3D model, you'll delve into how to make your 3D models take a tileable texture correctly, because there is some stuff you have to actually do to the model. But we, for these demos, will already have these set up for you where you can just make the texture tileable and it'll automatically work on there. So the texture tile automatically work on is that, tileable, seamless, the name kind of speaks for itself, where we have a texture that tiles in all directions. So it doesn't matter that this doesn't fit into that UV square. Once the UV hits, once that, UV part of that wall hits the end of that square, the texture repeats itself. So we can see a little bit where that texture is repeating. We can see like this here and this here. And that's going to happen, but kind of your job creating tileable textures is to minimize that repeated look. We definitely want to get rid of obvious seams on the materials, but some repeated characteristics will always happen. It's just kind of your artistic eye to minimize that as much as possible. So I'm going to jump over into Photoshop and we're going to create two tileable textures. I'm going to show you some different techniques. So let's go to, so there's two different ways we could approach this. We could either open up that picture itself and, crop out what we need, or we can start with a document ourselves. I do prefer to usually start with my own new document so that I can set the resolution itself and I know what exactly I'm working with. So two very important things with working with textures and materials for games specifically. One, they always need to be a square shape. So we can't have rectangle shapes, we need it to always be a perfect square. Two, the size needs to always be a power of 2. Most game engines will force it into a power of 2 anyway, and we don't want them to distort our images, scaling up or down without us specifically doing that. So let's make sure that we are setting it as a power of 2. So your power of 2s are going to be 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, 1024, 2048, or 4096. You really shouldn't need to ever do higher than a 4K texture. The only reason you might ever use an 8K texture is if you were planning to work larger and downsize it yourself later on. But for us, we're just going to be very simple since this is a demo. Usually I do like to build all my textures as 4K textures and then resize them down if I need to. But since this is just a demo and I want to make sure that it can, function correctly on your computers, we're just going to do a 1024 pixel by 1024. So we're going to start with that. I'm going to hit create and we have our starter image. Again, usually we wouldn't work this small, but for the sake of the demo, we're doing that. When you work on your projects, you're probably going to want to work at a 2K or a 4K. The one caveat with that is if you are finding your own starter images. Like I'm providing you with 2 starter images for this, the concrete and the brick. Make sure that you are finding them large enough. So for instance, this concrete is only a 1600 by 1066. So, you know, I can make a tileable out of this. Like there, you know, I could just have it, you know, multiple times in my space, but be aware that we should never just take this and scale it up to fit a 4096. We should do various methods to maintain that resolution. Same thing with the brick. The brick is a lot larger, so we are going to work on a 2K with this one, but just be very aware of the size of your source images that you start with, and you should never scale them up to work. Okay, so I don't usually like to drag them in and drop them in because, you know, it does a kind of its own scaling to fit, which I don't like because, you know, that doesn't fit in there. It scaled it down for me. So instead, I'm going to drag and drop and make it its own tab. The other way we could do this is we could crop the image from here, but I kind of prefer to try to pick the area of the image that I want to work in. And it tends to be a little bit easier by opening it up and then using the rectangle marquee tool to choose my spot. So again, it's going to be a 1024. So I do want to make sure that my marquee select is set as a fixed style, and then I can come right into here and change it to a 1024 in all dimensions. So I know where I'm picking in this image. So I can, you know, click and drag and I get my, you know, selection of where can I select a full 1024. And I probably don't want to select over here. It's a little bit, you know, there's a lot of very obvious details that I would have to, you know, fix, but also it's really dark and it's really light. Trying to find an area that's a little bit more even on here is going to make my life easier in the long run. So I'll probably just grab this bottom corner here. It should be kind of snapping in anyway. So I'm going to hit Control C on the keyboard to copy this. And I'm going to go back over into my document I created and hit Control and V to paste it in. So now I have that in there. So it's probably not by default very tileable. You rarely get lucky that you don't have to do some minimal fixing, but there's a very easy way to tell if this is tileable. The first thing I'm going to do is I always create a backup layer of what I'm working with this. In case I make a mistake, I can always go back in and you know, delete it and go back to my original. So I'm just going to right click and duplicate this layer. I'm going to hide my original one. Next, with this layer selected, I'm going to go underneath Filter, Other, and do an Offset filter. This is going to be your friend when you're making tileable textures in here. So let's do an offset. The key is I do need to know the size of my document. So if you remember, this is a 1024 by 1024. So offsetting it by 1024 isn't really going to do much for me because it's just going to loop back around all the way back to the beginning. So I do need to do half, and I have my, you know, the resolution is down here too as a reminder, half of this so I can see what that halfway seam looks like. So 1024 by 1024. So I'm going to do a 512 by 512 and hit OK. And we can start to see where that is. We can see, you know, again, the more kind of organic the texture, the less issue you have with seams. Let me move this out of the way. But we can see that really slight seam right there, and that's what we're going to want to fix. And there's a couple different ways that we can do this, but I'm going to kind of show you kind of like the easy way, and then I'm going to show you a couple other tools that we can use in case like this doesn't work. And we'll also fix some of the blemishes too, like we'll get rid of like this line here. So the first thing is I'm going to grab my lasso tool, and I'm going to lasso around one of those larger egregious areas. Then I'm going to use this right here, this little pop-up box that happens when you use this, and I can just use the generative fill. This kind of takes what it already has in there into account. I really don't need to type anything in here. It's just going to kind of sample what's already there. And it's going to generate what should go in there. And it's going to take a moment. And what it's going to do is put this on a new layer. In case we don't like it, we could always just delete it. And it did an okay job. Yours might turn out a little bit better than mine. I think I made my selection a little bit too big. Do you see that? It got a little bit blurry. So the nice thing about this that it does put it on a new layer is if we don't like it, we can just delete it. So I could come in here and try to clean it up with a smaller selection. That might give me some better results. Generally, generative fill does a pretty decent job for some of these more, I like to call them like organic. Like it's not like a very hard pattern. It's just kind of shapes and colors. And that's not too bad. It's a little bit blurry, but we minimized it. So if we're happy with that, we can hit Control E to merge that down into the original. Maybe up here, we'll do a little bit of a generative fill. But, you know, we want to be careful that we're not doing too much cleanup that it starts to get muddy around. That one looks pretty good, so I'll merge that one down. And the last major one I see is right here. So we're going to fill this in just like the others. And I'm going to show you a couple other tools too. You can dive a lot deeper into making tileable textures with a lot of different like level fixes and like other ways to tweak it. But at our stage, just kind of cleaning up some of those seams is pretty good. Okay, so we're going to say that those are done. But let's kind of work on fixing maybe like this thing right here. So one of the things that we could also use to fix this is going to be the clone stamp. This is generally useful if you have like a really major issue. Clone stamp is usually what I used to use before generative fill. You have like a major issue that it's like a big contrasting change or like these very larger spots. This is kind of a really quick way to do this. I do recommend not working on that layer that's kind of like your main layer. I would make a new layer to do this on in case you don't like it and you want to delete it. And what we can do then is make sure that the clone stamp is set from sample current layer to current and below, or you can do all layers too if you need to. The way this works is I'm going to change my brush size to make it smaller. I do like to kind of soften the edge too, not necessarily too hard, too soft, but I definitely don't want it to be like a super hard edge because it becomes very obvious that we did this. And what we do is we hold Alt, and you see when you hold the Alt key, it turns into like a bullseye because this is where you're picking to sample from. So I would kind of pick like a nicer area, maybe here, and I click once and I let it go. And we can see that we see the pattern of where we selected inside of our brush. So then if I just kind of click and drag, we can see I have the little crosshair showing me where I'm sampling from, and I can kind of buff out those mistakes. Again, we don't want to do this too much. If you start like clone stamp, clone stamp, clone stamp, it gets very obvious. One of the ways we can combat this is by, you know, sampling around a lot of different places. So we're not just clone stamping the same area. So I can easily clone stamp out some of these blemishes. And it's a lot less obvious. Okay. The other tools that we could possibly use for this would be the healing brush. Works pretty well. Kind of similar where you hold Alt and do a sample, and then you kind of brush, you know, oops, sorry, gotta change my sample to current and below. You do your sample, and then it kind of does more of it's very similar. It kind of like takes your sample and kind of blends it a little bit differently. I would definitely recommend playing with some of these and seeing what the difference is. Usually the one I do like to show, if I make a quick, a quick one, not really meant to, I'm not making like a texture, but just to kind of show you what these do. Let's go back to this and let's fill this in real quick with some color. So let's say we have red and we have like a blue over here. Clone stamp, very obviously, what it does is it clones that spot. So it's kind of like a real one-to-one to get that out. But the healing brush is a little bit different. So if we, for instance, do that, you can see that it kind of blends it a little bit more versus, let me zoom in so you can see, that hard, like I placed it on there. So like if I do this, you can see it kind of blending. I don't want to say it's like a smudge because it does take kind of like that texture into account, but it's a little bit slightly different of a blend. So just be aware of the two and try different things as you work with this. One other method I do want to show, and this is really helpful if you have like a really egregious seam. Like let's say there was a huge kind of color difference and nothing else is working. This is kind of like, if this doesn't work, you probably need to choose a new texture. I'm going to first duplicate my original, because remember, this is the one that we did not offset. Hide that original again. And then turn on my offset one. What I can do is use my erase tool, or if I want to be fancy, I'm not certain that erase is going to work, I could just use my mask. Actually, a mask would probably be a little bit better since it's non-destructive. And then I can kind of erase away those seams. I'm masking out where those seams are so that I can see the texture underneath it. So it's kind of like a sandwich, we're cutting through and seeing the layer below. So like we know that that one is not, seamy, because that's the not offset one. And this can be an easy way to fix, like, oh, that's a little bit too harsh, a little bit too dirty. So we can erase away some of those problems. Honestly, you could use a combination of all these. So like if we're starting to notice then that that's a little bit weird, we could come back in with like our heal, try to fix up some of those areas. The last one that I'm going to show with this one is going to be the patch tool. Again, works different than some of the other ones. This one, you do have to work on the layer you want to fix. So I'm going to work on this one. What you do is you kind of select a patch, and then if you slide around, you can see that it's trying to take, that destination and kind of fill it in. So like if you say, oh, this part here, I don't like this part. So I'm going to select that. I'm going to click and drag and say, I want it to look closer to that. And then it kind of like fills in around there. Once we're all done, what we do need to do is we do need to merge all of our fixes into a single layer. So I'm going to merge those layers. And we do need to do another offset. So I'm going to do a filter, other offset again to make sure that I'm flipping it back around. Did that work? Oh, I guess it did. I guess I did that big erase, so it wasn't super obvious. And the idea is we need to just double check now that this is a tileable texture. So we can see the original and the changes. So this should work pretty well now on a tileable surface. What if though, what if we need to do something that isn't quite so organic, such as our brick texture? So let's try our brick texture and see what happens with this one. This one is a little bit larger in the source, so we can start with a larger base one. So let me close out some of these. Let me first save this one. I'll do it here, just in case I need to open it again. I'm gonna close out some of these just to save on some space. I don't need that one. So let's make our base one. Let's do a file new. This one is a little bit larger, so we can actually do a 2048 by 2048 for this one. Next, I'm going to go back to here. I'm going to use my marquee tool, and I do want to make sure I do my fixed size at a 2048 by 2048. And let me zoom out a little bit. So if I click, you know, this is, I got messed up the size, 2048. Oh, I got it. Okay. So I can be a little bit strategic with how I'm trying to pick this. So, you know, I'm a little bit lucky that I can see that I can almost get the square in there. Do you see this? It's just a little bit too wide, and I need it to, you know, a little bit too long. This is an instance where it is okay if we kind of cheat a little bit with our pushing and pulling and maybe scale it a little bit. But we are having some issues with some straightness. This image is a little bit crooked with some of the stuff. We can see like the bricks are kind of not lined super straight. So we could do some fixes first. I'm going to show you that might make your life a little bit easier in the long run. We can either do our work here, or we can decide to choose a little bit larger of an image and copy it over into our square one. For the sake of that, I'm just going to take it something a little bit larger and copy it over to square one. So let's maybe bump this up to a 2400 by 2400. I just need that extra little bit of pixel room so that I can fix some things. So kind of pick where you want to, you know, around where you're going to want. So I'm going to maybe pick pushed out a little bit here, because the idea is I'm going to eventually take this brick down to here and over. So maybe something like this. Control C. Go over to my size and Control V. Ultimately, I'm going to want it something like this, but we can see that there's some issues. Some stuff isn't super straight. I want to kind of tweak that a little. It's also good practice for working with some of the tools. So I'm going to kind of pull some guides down on here to kind of help me with keeping some stuff straight. So this one's not too bad. I think it's this one that's kind of a little bit wonky. But the big one is this right here. We can see that this is off. And I kind of want to straighten this out a little bit. Always, I'm going to duplicate this layer in case I make a mistake. Hide that back up. Then what I want to do is use the Edit, Transform, Skew. If you've never worked with this, it's really handy to kind of fix if pictures are at a weird kind of perspective, because I can kind of push and pull on these corners of my image. And this is why I kind of also made this a little bit bigger than I needed, because I want to be able to, oh, I'm getting a little bit of a snap. Let's turn snap off temporarily. I don't need that. We can kind of fit this in a little bit straighter. Zoom out some. Pull this over. And we can see I'm trying to line up that back end. I'm trying to keep this lined up too. And we can see the bricks are getting a little bit straighter. This might take a few times. Let's check over here. I'm going to skew it again. Edit, transform, skew. Because this is lined up, but I want to pull this one over. There we go. Yeah, a couple of them are going to be a little bit off, but we can always fix that later. The big thing is kind of like the start and the end. But that looks a lot straighter than it was to begin with. So let me clear out those guides. So view, always lose these. Oop, there we go, guides, clear guides. And I'm going to turn my snap back on. I have to be kind of thoughtful of where I'm going to make this tile. So this is a very obvious pattern. So I know it's, you know, this brick corner, then halfway, brick corner, halfway, brick corner, halfway, brick corner, halfway, brick corner, halfway. So I'm going to want it to kind of tile here, or it's going to end here. And even though I did say, like, don't ever scale, this is a tiny baby scale. It's not the end of the world. Also, if I was working with this for real, I would be working at a much larger size. So a little bit of a scale up is going to be fine because ultimately I would be scaling it down. But for the sake of getting this to tile closer, I am going to end up doing a scale. So I'm going to hit Control T. And I'm going to kind of pull this. I'm going to hold Shift and pull it downwards a little. Over here, I'm going to hold Shift and see if I need to kind of tweak this a little bit. And I should be good with this. So we got that corner. We got that corner. I might need to skew it just a little bit more too once I get this done. Got that. So let's do a quick skew. Edit. Transform skew. And I'm just going to kind of tap this corner down a little so we get that nice line going right there. Okay. Looking pretty good. Next, and this is going to seem a little bit weird. Well, first, let's duplicate this layer because we did a lot of work to that. And the next steps, I might mess up stuff by accident. So always keep backups. If you want to be really neat, we could create a backup group and drop all those into there to keep our stuff organized. But what we need to do first, before we do our offset, I'm going to show you why. We're going to need to actually select everything and cut it to its own layer. Otherwise, if we do an offset on this before that, we're going to get it to, you know, wrap around. And, you know, we're going to see, because remember we went past it, it's going to kind of push it down into here. So we need to be mindful of that when we're making tileables, if we do paste something in that's larger than our image, the offset's just going to show you first what is hanging off the side of that. We don't want to do that either. That's not going to help us. So instead, what we need to do first is we need to select everything. Let me change this back to normal. Select everything. Right click, do a layer via cut. And then I'm going to go ahead and just delete that one. It doesn't look like there is anything in that one. It's all of our offhangs. So now we can do our filter other offset. Remember this was a 2048, so halfway is actually going to be a 1024 this time. So 1024 by 1024. And if we were really good with our skew and our trimming, we can tell that there honestly isn't much of a noticeable seam. We did a really good job of that. What if there was though? We you know, sometimes you might be able to fix it with a generative fill, but when there's a very, you know, this is a very obvious seam, but now that we're having a much more specific texture, like we can't really, you know, it's not as organic as that concrete, we're going to have to be a little bit more precise with how we clean things up. You know, the generative fill did an okay job. I don't really like it though. I can kind of tell that it's not what it needs to be. So instead, this is, you know, sometimes a really good use of your patch tool. If, you know, all things depending on what you have, we can always try to find, you know, we don't want to do it too close, but we can always see if we can find a different one that will match a little bit closer. Because, you know, we want it to look like a brick, so we can't really have it be... Oops. Try it again. It slipped at the last second. Let's try. It's too not big enough. So sometimes like this is where the patch tool can really shine. You know, it messed up down there though, so that's why you got to be very mindful of that. We could try a clone stamp too. A clone stamp would be a little bit more, you know, for smaller things. So like if I just need to fix that, I could come in and like use like this corner as my starter and kind of just fix that one little bit right there. Same thing, if we want to be really picky, and I'm usually really picky, we can see we have that little seam. This might be a good opportunity to clone stamp that little seam out, and there's a very obvious one right there. So since it's the same brick, it kind of maintains like that same color. So clone stamp can be your friend when you're trying to be a lot more precise. Something like this though, you could use, I would try maybe the spot healing or the healing brush first. Just because remember, the healing brush is kind of like that blend one. Let me actually do that seam right there. Kind of blend it. And it might kind of blend it a little bit better. So a lot of little tools. And if, you know, this kind of technique can be helpful not just for making tileables. I mean, outside of games, I have used this to make my own like desktop backgrounds if I need like a tileable image, or for like PowerPoint presentations, you're trying to make like a really fun PowerPoint tileable background. You can use this for a lot of things outside of games. Ooh, that's a little too, see, the spot healing smushed it a little too much. So, you know, take your time with this. This isn't a race. And, you know, just be very mindful of this. All right. So let's do, whoops. Let's do our offset back. So filter other offset. There we go. We can see that we don't see any more seams. And it's okay that these are popping out a little bit on the side. It's mostly easier just to make sure sometimes like those corners line up really well as like a nice kind of guide to making your tileables. One last thing I'd like to show you with this is another way that we can check your stuff right in Photoshop is if we go to View, we could turn on Pattern Preview. And we're going to say OK. And what we can do now is see it kind of tiling around. So if we zoom out, we can definitely see that that is a tileable texture. So that again is just View, Pattern Preview, and when we're done, we can turn it off. I don't like working necessarily in this mode. I find it really distracting, but it's kind of like a nice way to be able to see the final results. So this is, again, there's not one recipe to make something tile in Photoshop. There's lots of tools. There's lots of new tools coming out. As of the making of this video, there might, you know, be some tools that just came out I'm not aware of. I know that the Adobe AI generative stuff is really powerful. So as long as you are finding ways to make this not noticeably tile, whatever method, inside of Photoshop you need to do to get there. Obviously not just saying generate me a tileable texture. We do like to use the photos as a nice backdrop so that we can have the variety that we need, as well as get a much more accurate to what we want result than relying on whatever it spits out at us.